Hello, welcome to Return to Life. Today, we will listen to a story about the cracks in life where people have felt weak, full of doubt, yet kept moving forward. If you are standing between exhaustion and hope, this story may be for you.
The operating room was quieter than most people imagine. No shouting, no rushing footsteps, just the steady rhythm of machines and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. A surgeon stood still for a moment, hands hovering above the draped body on the table, eyes fixed on something only he could see. After nearly 20 years in trauma surgery, pauses like this were rare. If he had come in 12 hours earlier, the surgeon finally said, his voice low, almost careful, "We wouldn't be here." No one replied. There was nothing to say. Richard Miller lay unconscious beneath the bright surgical lights, his chest rising and falling with mechanical precision. To anyone passing by, he looked like thousands of other patients who came through this hospital every year. 61 years old, broad shoulders, calloused hands, a man who had worked hard his entire life. Nothing about him suggested this moment was inevitable. Rick Miller didn't ignore his body because he was careless. He ignored it because he trusted it. For over 6 decades, his body had carried him through long shifts, bad weather, missed meals, and injuries that would have sent other men straight to the emergency room. He had learned, over time, that pain usually passed. Scratches healed, soreness faded. Life went on, and most of the time, he was right. 12 hours earlier, Rick had still been at home. That morning had started like so many others in the quiet Ohio suburb, where he and his wife Linda had lived for nearly 30 years. The house was modest but well kept. 1 floor, a small porch, a garage that smelled faintly of motor oil and old tools. Rick liked it that way. Simple. Familiar. He'd woken up early, as he always did, poured himself a cup of coffee, and stepped outside to check on a few things he'd been meaning to fix in the garage. Retirement hadn't made him restless. If anything, it gave him more time to do what he'd always done, keep his hands busy. At some point, while moving a heavy box or brushing past a rough edge of metal shelving, Rick scraped his lower leg. It wasn't dramatic. There was no sharp sting, no blood pooling on the floor. Just a thin red line, barely noticeable through the hair on his shin. He looked down, shrugged, and wiped it with a paper towel. It didn't even seem worth a bandage, he would later say. By the time Linda joined him in the kitchen, Rick had already forgotten about it. Linda noticed things Rick didn't, or maybe she noticed them sooner. She had learned, over the years, to read the subtle changes in him. The way his shoulders tightened when something bothered him, the way his voice flattened when he didn't want to argue. That evening, she caught him rubbing his leg absently as they sat down for dinner. "You okay?" she asked. Rick nodded. "Just sore. Probably pulled something." She glanced at his leg. The skin looked fine, no swelling, no obvious redness. Nothing that screamed emergency. Still, something about the way he shifted his weight unsettled her. "Maybe you should get it checked," she said lightly, not wanting to sound alarmist. Rick smiled, the same smile he'd used 100 times before. "Linda, I've had worse. This is nothing." And that was the end of the conversation. That night, the pain didn't fade the way Rick expected it to. It didn't scream either. It whispered, a deep, dull ache that felt oddly out of proportion to what he could see on the surface. He shifted in bed, found a more comfortable position, and told himself it would pass by morning. By dawn, it hadn't. Rick sat on the edge of the bed, one hand pressed against his leg, trying to decide whether he was overthinking things. He didn't want to be the guy who ran to the hospital over every ache and pain. He'd spent his life solving problems, not creating them. Linda watched him from the doorway. "You didn't sleep," she said. "I'm fine," Rick replied automatically. "Just stiff." She hesitated. "Rick." He looked up at her, a flicker of irritation crossing his face. Not at her, but at the idea itself. The idea that this could be something serious. The idea that his body, the same body that had carried him through decades of hard work, might be betraying him over something so small. "Let's give it some time," he said. "I always bounce back." The words hung in the air longer than either of them realized, because while Rick believed them completely, something else was already happening beneath his skin. Something that didn't care about experience, toughness, or how many times a man had been right before. And by the time anyone truly understood what was wrong, time would no longer be on his side. Rick Miller had always believed that routine was a form of stability. Every morning followed the same quiet pattern. Coffee first, then the garage, then whatever small project had been waiting patiently for his attention. He liked knowing where things belonged. Tools hung neatly on the wall, each one earned through years of work. The garage wasn't just a place to store things, it was proof of a life spent fixing, building, keeping things running. Linda sometimes joked that Rick trusted machines more than people. He didn't argue. Machines made sense. They broke for reasons. And if you understood those reasons well enough, you could usually fix them. People were different. Bodies were different. Rick's body, at least in his mind, had always been reliable. For nearly 40 years, he'd worked as an industrial electrician, long shifts in loud plants where mistakes could cost you fingers, or worse. He'd been shocked more than once, crushed his hand under heavy equipment, fallen from a ladder and walked it off. Every injury had taught him the same lesson: pain didn't always mean danger. Sometimes pain was just noise. That belief had served him well. It had kept food on the table, paid off the house, raised 2 kids who now lived lives of their own. Rick wore his scars like quiet medals. Proof that he'd endured. So when the ache in his leg lingered into the second day, he treated it the same way he treated everything else, by working through it. He spent that afternoon in the yard, trimming back overgrown bushes, wincing occasionally when he put weight on his right leg. The pain felt deeper now, not sharp, but heavy, like something pressing outward from inside. He checked the skin again. Still nothing dramatic. No swelling, no angry redness, just that same thin scratch, already starting to fade. Linda watched him from the kitchen window. "You're limping," she said when he came back inside. Rick waved her off. "Just sore muscles." She frowned. "Sore muscles don't usually hurt like that." He shrugged, reaching for the ice pack from the freezer. "You'd be surprised." Linda didn't push further, but the unease settled in her chest. She had lived with Rick long enough to know when he was minimizing something, not out of stubbornness, but out of habit. He'd spent a lifetime being the one others leaned on. Admitting vulnerability didn't come easily. That evening, Rick finally agreed to stop by the urgent care clinic a few miles away. Not because he was worried, but because Linda looked tired of asking. The waiting room smelled faintly of disinfectant and old coffee. Rick sat stiffly in a plastic chair, legs stretched out in front of him, trying not to feel foolish. He'd seen worse injuries patched up in break rooms with duct tape and paper towels. This felt like overkill. The nurse took his vitals. Normal, no fever, blood pressure slightly elevated, but Rick chalked that up to irritation. A young physician's assistant examined his leg, pressing gently around the area. Rick winced. "That hurts?" she asked. "More than it should," Rick admitted. She nodded thoughtfully, then stepped back. "Probably a mild skin infection, or possibly a muscle strain. Nothing too concerning." She prescribed antibiotics, recommended rest, and sent him home with a smile. Linda felt a small wave of relief wash over her as they walked back to the car. Rick felt vindicated. "See?" he said. "Told you it was nothing." That night, Rick took his first dose of antibiotics and waited for the familiar easing that usually followed. But the relief never came. Instead, the pain seemed to deepen, spreading in a way that felt wrong. It wasn't localized anymore. It radiated, as if the ache had found new pathways. He lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening to the steady rhythm of Linda's breathing beside him. By morning, the pain was unmistakable. Rick swung his legs over the side of the bed and froze. Standing sent a sharp jolt through him, stealing his breath. He sat back down, heart pounding, annoyed more than afraid. "This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Linda woke at the sound of his voice. "What's wrong?" she asked. Rick didn't answer immediately. He didn't want to give the pain more weight than it deserved. He didn't want to name it. "It's worse," he finally said. She reached for his leg, gently pulling the covers back. The skin still didn't look alarming. Maybe a bit warm, maybe slightly discolored, but nothing that explained the intensity of his reaction. Linda felt a familiar frustration rise in her throat, the kind that comes when logic doesn't match reality. "Rick," she said quietly, "pain like this isn't normal." He exhaled sharply. "The meds need time. The PA said so, but it's getting worse," she insisted. Rick looked at her, his jaw tightening. "I don't want to spend all day in an ER over a scratch." It wasn't anger, it was fear, disguised as reason. Fear of being told something he didn't want to hear. Fear of becoming a patient instead of a problem solver. Linda nodded, but the look in her eyes didn't soften. She had learned when to back off, and when not to forget. By midday, Rick was sweating. The pain had crept up his leg, no longer confined to the area of the scratch. It felt deeper now, as if it were coming from beneath the muscle itself. He swallowed another painkiller, then another. with little effect. Something about the pain unsettled him. It didn't respond the way pain usually did. It didn't ebb and flow. It escalated. Still, Rick told himself, there had to be an explanation. There always was. By late afternoon, Linda noticed Rick struggling to focus. His answers came slower. He seemed distant, as if he were fighting something invisible. "Rick," she said, her voice sharper now, "this isn't right." He looked up at her, eyes glassy but determined. "Let's just get through the night." Those words, simple, reasonable, would echo later in ways neither of them could have imagined. Because beneath the skin that still looked mostly normal, something was spreading rapidly along the deep connective tissue that held Rick's muscles together. A place no mirror could show. A place antibiotics couldn't easily reach. The most dangerous pain doesn't scream, it whispers. And by the time Rick understood that this pain was different, the quiet hours he thought he still had were already slipping away. By the third day, Rick stopped pretending the pain was manageable. It wasn't just that it hurt more. Pain, after all, was something he understood. This was different. It felt detached from the surface, as if whatever was causing it didn't care what the skin looked like. When he pressed gently around the scratch, the reaction was immediate and violent. His body recoiled before his mind could catch up. "That shouldn't hurt like that," he muttered. Linda watched him closely. She had noticed the small changes first, the way Rick moved more cautiously, the way his breathing changed when he stood up, the way he grew quieter, conserving energy as if his body had already decided something he hadn't. "You're not yourself," she said. Rick nodded slowly, rubbing his leg. "I know." They returned to urgent care that morning. The waiting room felt smaller this time, louder. Rick shifted in his chair, unable to find a position that didn't aggravate the pain. When the nurse called his name, he stood too quickly and nearly stumbled. The same physician's assistant examined him again. She frowned slightly this time, fingers pausing longer over the area where Rick flinched. "Pain's worse?" she asked. Much," Rick replied. "And it feels deeper." She checked his temperature. Still no significant fever. Blood pressure elevated again. She hesitated, then nodded. "Infections can take time to respond," she said. "Let's give the antibiotics another day. If it doesn't improve, go to the E." Rick didn't like that answer, but he accepted it. He wanted to accept it. It fit the story he'd been telling himself, that this was still something familiar, something predictable. On the drive home, Linda stared out the window. "That didn't sound very confident," she said. Rick tightened his grip on the steering wheel. "She didn't say it was serious. She didn't say it wasn't." He didn't respond. By afternoon, Rick's leg felt like it was on fire, though the skin remained deceptively calm. He sat on the couch, sweat beading at his temples, jaw clenched as waves of pain rolled through him. Painkillers barely touched it now. Each movement sent a sharp reminder through his body, as if invisible hands were pulling at something deep inside. He closed his eyes and tried to breathe through it, the way he had so many times before. "This is just pain," he told himself. "Pain passes." But this pain didn't. Linda knelt beside him, resting a hand on his arm. "Rick, please, this isn't normal." He opened his eyes and looked at her, really looked at her. There was fear there now, no longer masked by concern. Fear he hadn't seen in years. "I don't understand it," he said quietly. "It doesn't match what I'm seeing." And that was the problem. Rick had spent his life learning to trust what he could see. A frayed wire, a cracked panel, a broken connection. You found the source, fixed it, and moved on. But whatever was happening inside his leg didn't follow those rules. Beneath the skin, beneath the muscle, lies a network most people never think about. Thin sheets of connective tissue called fascia. They wrap around muscles, organs, and nerves, holding everything in place while allowing movement. They're strong, flexible, and largely invisible until something goes wrong. In rare cases, certain bacteria don't spread across the surface of the skin. They move along this deeper layer instead, traveling quickly through tissue that offers little resistance. The skin above can look almost normal, while destruction spreads underneath. That's why the pain doesn't make sense. That's why it feels wrong. By early evening, Rick couldn't put weight on his leg without gasping. Linda insisted they go to the emergency room. This time, Rick didn't argue. The ER was busy, the air thick with urgency. Rick was wheeled back quickly after the triage nurse noted his pain level and the way his leg reacted to touch. A physician examined him, eyes narrowing as Rick described the progression. "When did the pain start?" the doctor asked. 3 days ago, Rick said. It's been getting worse. And the scratch? Rick hesitated. That was nothing. Barely noticeable. The doctor exchanged a glance with the nurse. Blood was drawn. Fluid started. Rick watched the ceiling tiles pass by as they moved him to a room, his thoughts drifting in and out between waves of pain. For the first time, he felt something unfamiliar creeping in alongside the discomfort, uncertainty. Linda sat beside him, gripping his hand. You did the right thing, she said, though her voice wavered. Rick nodded, but doubt gnawed at him. Had he waited too long, or was this just another overreaction? The doctor returned with test results that didn't quite add up. Inflammatory markers were elevated, white blood cell count climbing. Signs of infection, but not in a way that matched the mild appearance of the skin. We're concerned about the level of pain you're in, the doctor said carefully. It's disproportionate to what we're seeing on the surface. Rick stared at him. So what does that mean? It means something deeper may be going on. That sentence landed heavier than anything else that day. Disproportionate pain, pain deeper than it looks. Rick felt a chill despite the warmth of the blankets. They ordered imaging, more blood tests. Time stretched and compressed all at once. Rick's leg throbbed relentlessly, the pain now constant, no longer coming in waves but settling into something steady and unforgiving. Linda watched the clock, counting minutes that seemed suddenly precious. At one point, Rick squeezed her hand. I should have come in sooner, he said, more to himself than to her. Linda swallowed hard. We're here now. But something in the doctor's expression suggested that now might not be enough. The first mention of a more serious diagnosis came quietly, almost reluctantly. There's a condition, the doctor began, choosing his words, that can cause severe pain before obvious skin changes appear. Rick's heart pounded. What condition? The doctor hesitated. Necrotizing fasciitis. Rick had never heard the term before. It didn't sound real. It sounded like something out of a medical textbook, not something that belonged in his body. What does that mean? Linda asked. It's a rapidly progressing infection, the doctor explained. It spreads along the deeper tissues. It's rare, but when it happens, time becomes very important. Rick felt a strange disconnect, as if the words were being spoken to someone else. Rapidly progressing, time becomes very important. For the first time since the pain began, Rick felt afraid, not of the pain itself, but of what it implied. That whatever this was, it had been moving quietly, steadily, while he debated whether or not to make a phone call. Antibiotics were started immediately. Stronger ones, broader coverage. Rick clung to that fact like a lifeline. Medicine fixes infections, he told himself. That's what medicine does. For a brief window, it seemed like the treatment might be working. The pain dulled slightly. Rick's breathing slowed. Linda felt hope flicker back to life. Maybe they caught it in time. But deep inside Rick's leg, blood flow was already being compromised. Toxins released by the bacteria damaged small vessels, cutting off circulation to surrounding tissue. And where blood cannot reach, medicine cannot follow. Antibiotics travel through the bloodstream. They cannot reach tissue that no longer has blood. That truth would soon matter more than anything else. By the middle of the night, Rick's condition worsened again. His pain spiked, sharper and more relentless than before. His heart rate climbed. His thoughts became hazy, words slipping out of order. Linda pressed the call button, panic creeping into her voice. The nurse arrived. Then the doctor. They spoke in measured tones, but the urgency was unmistakable now. This shouldn't be progressing like this, Linda said. The doctor nodded grimly. That's what concerns us. Rick drifted in and out, catching fragments of conversation. Surgery, imaging, consults. The room felt smaller, the air heavier. He remembered telling Linda earlier that day, I always bounce back. For the first time in his life, he wasn't sure that was true. And as the hours passed, the quiet realization settled in that the pain he had tried so hard to rationalize wasn't just a symptom. It was a warning, one he had heard, but not understood, until time had already started to run out. For a few hours, the hospital room felt almost calm. The antibiotics flowed steadily through the foreline, clear liquid dripping at a measured pace. Rick's breathing slowed. The relentless edge of the pain dulled just enough for him to notice the difference. He shifted slightly in the bed, and didn't gasp this time. Linda noticed it immediately. Is it better? She asked, leaning forward. Rick nodded, surprised. Yeah, I think it is. Hope, fragile and cautious, slipped back into the room. The doctor stopped by shortly after, scanning the monitor and Rick's chart. "We'll keep a close eye on you," he said. "Sometimes it takes a little while for the medication to really kick in." Those words landed gently, like permission to relax. Linda exhaled for the first time that day. She sat back in her chair, rubbing her temples. The fear that had been tightening her chest loosened just enough to let her breathe. Rick closed his eyes. For the first time in days, sleep felt possible. This was what he had been waiting for. Proof that he hadn't waited too long. Proof that his instincts were still reliable. "I told you," he murmured softly, more to himself than to Linda. "Just needed time." Linda didn't answer right away. She watched his face as it softened, the tension easing from his jaw. She wanted to believe it as badly as he did. Maybe this was the turning point. Rick drifted into a light sleep, the kind that comes when exhaustion finally overpowers discomfort. In his half-conscious state, he felt the warmth of the blankets, the steady hum of machines, the reassuring presence of Linda nearby. For a brief window, everything seemed under control. But false hope has a particular cruelty to it. It doesn't just disappoint, it convinces you to lower your guard first. By late evening, Rick woke with a jolt. The pain was back. Not the dull ache from before, but something sharper, more focused. He tried to shift his leg and froze as a surge of agony shot through him, stealing his breath. "Linda," he whispered. She was at his side instantly. "What is it?" "It's worse," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "It's worse than before." The nurse responded quickly, checking his vitals. Adjusting the fourth, Rick's heart rate had climbed. His blood pressure spiked again. Sweat beaded along his hairline. The medication hadn't failed gradually. It had stopped working altogether. The doctor returned, this time with a different expression. Less reassurance, more calculation. "This isn't the response we were hoping for," he said. Linda felt her stomach drop. "But you said—" "I know," the doctor replied gently. "That's why we're concerned." Rick clenched his fists, frustration boiling over into fear. "So what now?" The doctor paused. "We need to run more tests, and we're going to consult. Surgery." That word, surgery, cut through the room like a blade. Rick stared at him. "Surgery? For an infection?" The doctor didn't answer immediately. He glanced at Rick's leg, then back at his face. "When infections behave this way," he said carefully, "it means they're not responding to medication alone." Linda felt the weight of the moment settle over her. This wasn't a fork in the road anymore. It was a narrowing tunnel. As the night stretched on, Rick's condition continued to deteriorate. The pain spread further, radiating up his leg in a way that felt unnatural. His skin began to change, subtle at first, slight discoloration, a sheen that hadn't been there before. Linda noticed before anyone else. "His leg looks different," she said urgently. The nurse nodded, calling for the doctor again. Rick's thoughts became harder to hold on to. Sentences slipped away mid-formation. He felt strangely detached from his own body, as if he were watching events unfold from a distance. At one point, he laughed softly, an odd sound that startled Linda. "What's funny?" she asked, alarmed. Rick shook his head weakly. "I just can't believe this is happening." "Over a scratch." Linda squeezed his hand, her voice tight. "Don't talk like that." But Rick couldn't stop the thought from forming. He replayed the past few days in his mind. The garage, the paper towel, the moment he'd told Linda it was nothing. He had been so sure. The surgeon arrived shortly after midnight, older than the others, calm in a way that came from years of making impossible decisions. He examined Rick's leg, pressing gently in places that made Rick cry out despite himself. He studied the imaging results in silence, then turned to Linda. "We're concerned about how quickly this is progressing," he said. "What does that mean?" Linda asked, though she already sensed the answer. "It means we may be running out of time." Rick's heart pounded. "Time for what?" "For medication to work," the surgeon replied. "And when that happens, the only option left is surgery." Rick stared at him, disbelief flashing across his face. "You're talking about cutting me open?" The surgeon nodded once. "Yes." Linda felt tears burn behind her eyes. "Isn't there anything else you can try?" The surgeon shook his head slowly. "We are trying everything appropriate, but certain infections don't respect the usual rules." He paused, then added, "In some cases, waiting is the most dangerous thing you can do." Those words echoed in Rick's mind. Waiting. He had spent days doing exactly that. As the surgical team prepared, the antibiotics continued. Though everyone in the room understood their role had changed, They were no longer the solution. They were buying time, or trying to. Rick's leg throbbed violently now, the pain nearly unbearable. He clenched his teeth, gripping the sides of the bed. Linda leaned close, her forehead resting against his. "I'm here," she whispered. "I'm right here." Rick swallowed hard, his voice barely audible. "I should have listened to you." Linda shook her head, tears finally spilling over. "We'll get through this." Rick looked at her then, really looked at her, as if committing her face to memory. "I always bounce back," he said softly. The words sounded different now, less certain, almost like a question. Linda forced a small smile, though her heart was breaking. "I know," but the room no longer believed him. As they wheeled Rick toward the operating room, the false calm from earlier in the day felt like a cruel joke. The pain was worse, the stakes were clearer. And the clock, silent and indifferent, kept moving forward. Somewhere deep inside Rick's leg, blood vessels were collapsing under the assault of bacterial toxins. Tissue was dying piece by piece in places no one could see from the outside, and with each minute that passed, the line between what could be saved and what could not grew thinner. Rick closed his eyes as the doors to the operating suite swung open. For the first time since the pain began, he understood that this wasn't about toughness or patience or riding things out. This was about time, and time, he realized too late, was not on his side. Rick surfaced from anesthesia in fragments. Sound came first, the distant beeping of a monitor, muffled voices blending into one another. Then sensation, not pain exactly, but pressure. A heaviness that settled into his leg like something foreign had been placed there. He tried to move and felt hands gently restraining him. "Easy, Rick," a voice said. "You're okay. You're in the hospital." His eyelids fluttered open. The room was dimmer now, quieter than before. Linda was there, seated close to the bed, her eyes red and swollen. She smiled when she saw him awake, but it didn't reach her eyes. "What happened?" Rick asked. His throat felt raw. The nurse adjusted his fourth. "You've been through a lot. Try not to talk too much." Rick turned his head toward Linda. "Did it work?" She hesitated, just for a fraction of a second. But Rick noticed. "They cleaned out some of the infection," she said carefully. "They're watching you very closely." Rick nodded slowly, trying to make sense of the gaps in his memory. He remembered being wheeled down a hallway, bright lights, a mask over his face, someone telling him to count backward. He also remembered the surgeon's voice, calm but unmistakably serious. "Sometimes, waiting is the most dangerous thing you can do." Hours passed in a haze. Nurses came and went. Bags of medication were changed. Rick drifted in and out of sleep, his dreams filled with half-formed images of dark tunnels and rushing water. When he woke again, the pain was different. It wasn't sharp, it wasn't spreading, it was absent. Rick frowned, trying to move his leg. The heaviness remained, but the pain that had dominated his thoughts for days was gone, replaced by something harder to describe. A strange numbness. "Linda," he said, "it doesn't hurt anymore." Linda's smile this time was forced. "That's good," she said softly, but Rick's instincts, so quiet for days, stirred again. Pain disappearing abruptly didn't feel like relief. It felt like something had gone missing. The surgeon returned later that morning, accompanied by another physician. They stood at the foot of Rick's bed, charts in hand, expressions composed but grave. "We need to talk," the surgeon said. Rick straightened slightly, his heart rate quickening. "About what?" "About what we found during surgery," the surgeon replied. Linda reached for Rick's hand. The infection had progressed further than imaging suggested, the surgeon continued. "We removed all visibly dead tissue, but this type of infection doesn't always respect clear boundaries." Rick swallowed. "So, it's gone?" The surgeon didn't answer immediately. "That depends on how your body responds over the next several hours," he said, "and how much viable tissue remains." Rick stared at him. "You're saying you don't know." "I'm saying," the surgeon replied gently, "that antibiotics alone were never going to be enough." That sentence landed harder than anything Rick had heard so far. Antibiotics had always been the answer. The fix: you took the pills, waited a few days, and things improved. That was the rule Rick had lived by his entire adult life. "But I've been on the strongest ones," Rick said. "You said so." The surgeon nodded. "You are. And they're important. But antibiotics travel through the bloodstream." Rick frowned. So if tissue has lost its blood supply," the surgeon explained, "the medication can't reach it." Linda's grip tightened around Rick's hand. Rick felt a slow chill spread through him, unrelated to the temperature of the room. When bacteria release certain toxins, the surgeon continued, they damage small blood vessels. Once circulation is cut off, that tissue effectively becomes isolated. No oxygen, no immune response, no medication. Rick stared at the ceiling, the pieces finally aligning into a picture he didn't want to see. "You're saying," he said quietly, "that the medicine couldn't get where it needed to go?" "Yes, and that's why it kept getting worse," Rick murmured. The surgeon nodded once. This was the truth Rick hadn't understood before. The one no amount of toughness could override. Medicine can't revive tissue that's already dead. Antibiotics can't reach places where blood no longer flows. The room felt suddenly smaller. Rick's chest tightened as the realization settled in. All those hours he'd waited, all those moments he'd told himself to give it more time. Time hadn't been neutral. Time had been working against him. Linda wiped at her eyes, struggling to keep her voice steady. "What happens now?" The surgeon took a slow breath. "We watch, closely. If the infection continues to spread, we may need to take further action." Rick's pulse quickened. "What kind of action?" The surgeon met his gaze. "More surgery." Rick closed his eyes. He thought of the garage, the routine, the quiet confidence that came from knowing how things worked. None of that applied here. This wasn't a system he could understand by looking harder or trying longer. This was a system that had already moved past him. As the day wore on, Rick's condition wavered. His blood pressure fluctuated. His heart rate spiked without warning. Nurses checked his leg frequently, marking subtle changes on the skin. Linda watched every movement, every glance exchanged between staff. At one point, Rick grew confused, struggling to find words for simple thoughts. He asked the same question twice within minutes. Linda answered each time, though fear twisted in her stomach. "This isn't you," she whispered, brushing his hair back. "Just stay with me." Rick wanted to reassure her, wanted to say he was fine, that this was temporary, but the words felt hollow now. In rare moments of clarity, Rick replayed the past week in his mind. The scratch, the paper towel, the casual dismissal. He hadn't ignored the pain because he didn't care. He'd ignored it because he believed it followed rules he understood. That belief had been his armor for decades. Now it felt like a liability. The surgeon returned again in the afternoon, his tone more urgent. "The infection markers are rising," he said, "and the tissue around the affected area is not responding the way we hoped." Linda's heart sank. "What does that mean?" "It means the infection is still active," the surgeon replied, "despite everything we're doing." Rick stared at him. "So the antibiotics really aren't working. They're doing what they can," the surgeon said. "But they can't undo what's already happened." Rick nodded slowly, the truth finally undeniable. This wasn't about stronger drugs. This was about removing what could no longer be saved. The surgeon leaned forward slightly. "If we wait too long, the infection can enter the bloodstream. At that point, it becomes life-threatening in a matter of hours." Linda gasped softly. Rick felt his chest tighten again, this time with something closer to panic. "So what are you saying?" "I'm saying," the surgeon replied, "that time is no longer something we have to spare." The words echoed in Rick's mind. No longer something we have to spare. For the first time, Rick understood the full weight of what he had been bargaining with. He hadn't just delayed treatment. He had delayed blood flow, delayed access, delayed the only thing that could have stopped. This early enough. Linda leaned close to him, her voice trembling. "Rick, whatever they need to do, let them do it." Rick looked at her, really looked at her, the woman who had known him longer than anyone else, who had seen his strength and his stubbornness in equal measure. "I thought waiting was the safe choice," he said quietly. Linda shook her head, tears spilling freely now. "You didn't know," but Rick did know something now. In some illnesses, waiting isn't caution, it's surrender. As the team prepared for what might come next, Rick lay back against the pillows, his mind heavy with understanding. The pain that had once terrified him had been a warning, a signal, one he had felt clearly, but interpreted too late. The infection hadn't tricked him, his assumptions had. And as the day slipped toward evening, Rick realized that the question was no longer whether medicine could fix this. The question was how much of him could still be saved. The hallway leading to the operating room felt longer this time. Rick lay on the gurney, staring up at the ceiling lights as they passed overhead one by one. Each light flared briefly in his vision, then disappeared behind him. He counted them without realizing he was doing it. the way people sometimes count steps when they're afraid of falling. Linda walked beside him, one hand resting on the edge of the gurney, the other clutching his fingers as tightly as she could without hurting him. Neither of them spoke. There were no reassurances left to give, no small talk to distract from what both of them understood now. Whatever happened next would change everything. The doors to the operating suite swung open, releasing a burst of cold air that raised goosebumps along Rick's arms. The smell was different here, cleaner, sharper, unmistakable. He had smelled it before during minor procedures over the years, but never like this, never with this weight attached to it. The surgical team moved with practiced efficiency, calm voices, steady hands, no panic. That calmness was both comforting and terrifying. Rick realized they had done this before, many times, enough times to know how badly it could go. The anesthesiologist leaned over him. "Rick, I'm going to give you something to help you relax." Rick nodded faintly. Before the mask was placed over his face, he turned his head toward Linda. She stood just beyond the sterile line, her face pale, eyes fixed on him as if she were afraid to blink. "I'll be fine," Rick said softly. The words came automatically, a reflex built over decades. Linda's lips trembled. She nodded, though the certainty wasn't there anymore. "I'm right here," she said. Rick held her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Something passed between them then, an unspoken understanding that this wasn't just another hurdle, that this was a line being crossed. The mask descended. "Take slow, deep breaths," the anesthesiologist said. Rick inhaled. The air smelled faintly sweet, unfamiliar. His thoughts began to blur at the edges. As consciousness slipped away, one final realization surfaced with painful clarity. This wasn't about how strong he was. It never had been. When Rick was unconscious, his body told a story he could no longer control. The surgeon made the initial incision and immediately sensed what he had feared. The tissue beneath the skin didn't respond the way healthy tissue should. Its color was wrong, its texture wrong. When pressure was applied, there was no bleeding where there should have been. Dead tissue. More of it than expected. The infection had traveled swiftly along the fascia, the connective tissue that binds muscle groups together. It had moved with little resistance, releasing toxins that strangled blood vessels from the inside out. Where blood once flowed freely, there was now silence. The surgeon paused for a fraction of a second, not because he was uncertain, but because he understood the implications. He signaled to the team, "Extend the incision." They worked methodically, removing tissue layer by layer, constantly reassessing the boundary between what could be saved and what could not. That boundary kept shifting. Each time they thought they had reached viable tissue, another section revealed itself as compromised. The surgeon knew this pattern well. Necrotizing infections don't negotiate. They demand speed, decisiveness, sacrifice. Minutes stretched into an hour. Then more. The team worked without speaking much, communicating through gestures and brief, efficient phrases. Suction, clamp, cut, assess. Every decision carried weight. Remove too little, and the infection would continue. Remove too much, and the cost would be irreversible. Outside the operating room, Linda sat alone. Time moved strangely there. The clock on the wall seemed both frozen and relentless, its second hand ticking loudly in the quiet waiting area. She clasped her hands in her lap, then unclasped them, then clasped them again. Her foot tapped against the floor, then stopped, then started again. She replayed the past week over and over in her mind, searching for a moment she could have changed, a sentence she could have said differently, a tone she could have used that might have broken through Rick's confidence sooner. "You're limping. Maybe you should get it checked. This isn't normal." Each memory landed like a small, dull ache. A nurse approached her after what felt like an eternity. "Mrs. Miller?" Linda stood immediately, her heart pounding. "Yes? The surgery is still ongoing," the nurse said. "The surgeon will speak with you as soon as he can." Linda nodded, forcing herself to stay upright. "Thank you." She sat back down, hands trembling now. This was the part no one prepares you for, the waiting, the not knowing. The understanding that there are moments when love has no leverage at all. Inside the operating room, the surgeon faced the decision he had hoped to avoid. The infection had advanced to a point where preserving the limb in its current state posed a serious risk to Rick's life. Leaving compromised tissue behind would allow the bacteria to enter the bloodstream, triggering septic shock. The surgeon straightened, his voice steady but firm. "We need to be aggressive." There was no debate. This wasn't about function anymore. This was about survival. More tissue was removed. Boundaries redrawn. The team worked against a clock that no one could see but everyone felt. In cases like this, time isn't a background variable. Time is the treatment. The longer the delay, the more the infection wins. When the surgeon finally stepped back, exhaustion etched into his posture, he knew the outcome was uncertain. They had removed everything they could identify as non-viable. But necrotizing infections have a cruel way of revealing themselves slowly. What they couldn't see yet might still be there. When Rick emerged from anesthesia hours later, the world felt heavy and distant. His body seemed foreign, disconnected. He tried to move his leg and felt resistance, bandages, immobility. The surgeon was there when Rick fully opened his eyes. "Rick," he said, pulling up a chair. "I'm going to be honest with you." Rick swallowed, his mouth dry. "Okay, we removed a significant amount of infected tissue," the surgeon continued. "More than we initially anticipated." Rick's heart pounded. "Did you get it all?" "We got what we could see," the surgeon said. "But with this kind of infection, we have to assume there may be more." Rick stared at him. "So what does that mean?" "It means the next 24 hours are critical," the surgeon replied. "If the infection continues to progress, we may need to go back in." Rick closed his eyes briefly, absorbing the weight of the words. "And if you don't?" he asked. The surgeon held his gaze. "Then the risk to your life increases dramatically." Linda stood at the foot of the bed, tears streaming freely now. Rick looked at her, his chest tightening with something deeper than fear. All those hours he had waited, all those moments he had told himself tomorrow would be soon enough. They hadn't just delayed care, they had given the infection time to entrench itself. The surgeon stood to leave, then paused. "Rick," he said, "this isn't something you caused, but it is something we can't undo." Rick nodded slowly. After the surgeon left, silence filled the room. Linda moved closer, resting her forehead against Rick's shoulder. "I'm so scared," she whispered. Rick lifted his hand weakly, brushing her hair back. "I know." For the first time, he didn't say he would be fine. He didn't promise anything. He simply lay there, listening to the steady beep of the monitor, understanding at last what the pain had been trying to tell him from the very beginning. The bacteria hadn't attacked him suddenly. They hadn't overwhelmed him in a dramatic rush. They had taken advantage of time. Time he thought he had. Time he thought he could afford to lose. The bacteria didn't kill Rick quickly. The hours he believed he still had did. And now, as night settled over the hospital once again, Rick faced the truth that no amount of experience or endurance could change. Some illnesses don't wait for you to be ready. They punish hesitation, and the cost of that hesitation is measured not in pain, but in what you're forced to give up to stay alive. Rick survived. That was the sentence the surgeon used when he finally sat down across from Linda 2 days later. His shoulders slumped with a fatigue that went deeper than lack of sleep. "He made it through the worst of it," the surgeon said. "The infection is under control." Linda let out a sound somewhere between a sob and a laugh, pressing a hand to her mouth as her knees nearly gave way. She had been holding herself together with sheer willpower, afraid that if she allowed herself to relax even for a second, everything would collapse. Rick was alive. For a moment, that felt like enough. When Linda was finally allowed back into Rick's room, she barely recognized him. He lay propped up in the bed, thinner somehow, his face pale against the white sheets. Tubes and lines ran in and out of his body, quiet reminders of how much help he still needed just to exist. His eyes opened when he heard her footsteps. "Hey," he said, his voice weak but unmistakably his. Linda rushed to his side, gripping his hand with both of hers. "Hey," she replied, tears spilling freely now. "You scared me." Rick managed a faint smile. "Yeah, sorry about that." They sat in silence for a moment, just holding on to each other. The steady beep of the monitor filled the room, grounding them in the present. Rick shifted slightly, then winced. His gaze drifted down toward the heavy bandages covering his leg. A realization flickered across his face. "Linda," he said quietly, what did they have to do?" She swallowed hard. "They had to remove a lot," she said carefully. "More than they wanted to." Rick closed his eyes, absorbing the words. He had known this moment was coming, had felt it looming even before the surgery. Still, knowing something is different from hearing it spoken aloud. After a pause, he asked the question he had been avoiding. "Did I lose it?" Linda squeezed his hand. "Not all of it," she said, "but enough that things won't be the same." Rick nodded slowly. He didn't ask for details. Not yet. He wasn't ready to attach specifics to the loss. For now, it was enough to know that a part of him, something that had carried him through decades of work and routine, was gone. The following days were a blur of cautious optimism and harsh reality. Doctors monitored Rick closely, checking blood work, watching for any signs of recurring infection. Each hour without deterioration was a small victory, but recovery came with reminders. The first time Rick tried to sit up on his own, pain shot through him. Not the deep, consuming pain from before, but something sharper, more localized. A pain that marked absence rather than invasion. Physical therapy began sooner than Rick expected. A therapist helped him dangle his legs over the side of the bed, guiding his movements carefully. Rick looked down and finally saw what had been done. The bandages concealed the worst of it, but the shape was unmistakably altered. His leg ended sooner than it should have. The sight hit him harder than any physical pain had. He looked away quickly, jaw tightening. Linda noticed. She always did. "It doesn't change who you are," she said softly, though her voice trembled. Rick didn't answer. For the first time in his life, his body felt unfamiliar, unreliable. The quiet confidence he had carried for so long had been replaced by uncertainty at every movement. Standing required assistance. Balance had to be relearned. Independence, something he had never questioned before, now came with conditions. Some nights, Rick lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying the past over and over. The scratch, the waiting, the moments he had dismissed Linda's concern with a wave of his hand. He wasn't angry. That was the strangest part. He didn't feel anger toward the doctors, or even toward himself. What he felt instead was a heavy, aching regret. Not dramatic, not explosive, just constant. "I keep thinking about that day in the garage," he admitted to Linda one night, his voice barely above a whisper. "If I'd just stopped what I was doing and gone in." Linda rested her head against his shoulder. "You didn't know," Rick exhaled slowly. "I thought I did." That, more than anything, was the truth that haunted him. Rick had trusted his experience, trusted the fact that he'd been through worse and come out the other side. What he hadn't understood was that his body had changed, and so had the risks. The infection hadn't cared about his history, it had only cared about time. Weeks later, Rick was discharged from the hospital and transferred to a rehabilitation facility. The world outside felt brighter and harsher than he remembered. Simple things, getting dressed, moving from bed to chair, required focus and patience he had never needed before. Linda became his anchor. She learned how to help him transfer safely, how to watch for signs of fatigue, how to encourage without pushing too hard. Their roles shifted subtly but permanently. Rick was still Rick, but he was no longer invincible. One afternoon, during a physical therapy session, Rick paused mid-exercise, breathing hard. "I used to climb ladders all day," he said, half to himself. The therapist nodded. "And now you're learning something harder," she replied. "How to start over." Those words stayed with him. Starting over wasn't something Rick had planned for. He had imagined retirement filled with projects and routines, not prosthetics and appointments, not learning how to walk again. But as days turned into weeks, something else emerged beneath the frustration. Perspective. Rick began to notice the small victories. Standing a little longer, taking a few steps with assistance, laughing at himself when he lost balance instead of cursing his body. One evening, Linda brought him a pair of old work boots from home. They were scuffed and worn, the soles uneven from years of use. "You don't have to keep them," she said. "I just thought you might want to see them." Rick held one in his hands, turning it slowly. Nothing about it looked dangerous. Nothing about it hinted at how close he had come to losing everything. "I almost didn't come home at all," he said quietly. Linda nodded. "I know." Rick looked up at her. "I keep thinking, if I tell this story to someone else, maybe they won't wait like I did." Linda squeezed his shoulder. "Then it won't be for nothing." Rick survived, but survival came with a cost that would follow him for the rest of his life. A cost measured not just in what he lost physically, but in what he learned too late. Pain had tried to warn him, not loudly, not dramatically. It had whispered. And now, every step Rick took, careful, deliberate, earned, was a reminder of how thin the line can be between inconvenience and catastrophe. He was alive, but he would never again confuse time with safety. Months later, Rick stood in the doorway of the garage and realized how much had changed. The space looked the same, the shelves, the tools, the faint smell of oil and dust that had always felt comforting. But the way he entered it, slowly, deliberately, leaning slightly on his cane, was a reminder that this was no longer the same man walking into the same room. Linda watched from the kitchen window, just as she always had. Only now she didn't look for signs of stubborn confidence. She looked for balance, for fatigue, for the quiet signals that mattered more than words. Rick reached the workbench and rested his hands on its edge. He didn't start a project. He didn't need to. Just standing there felt like a small victory. For a long time after the hospital, Rick avoided talking about what had happened. Not because he was ashamed, but because he didn't yet know how to frame it. People expected a clean ending, survival, gratitude, a sense of closure. But the truth was messier. Surviving hadn't erased the question that lingered in his mind. What if? What if he had listened sooner? What if he had trusted the pain instead of his past experience? What if he had gone to the emergency room that first night instead of telling himself to wait until morning? Those questions didn't demand answers anymore. They served a different purpose now. They reminded him that his body had tried to speak to him long before the crisis became visible. Pain, Rick understood now, isn't always a measure of damage. Sometimes it's a warning system, one that doesn't care how strong you think you are or how many times you've been right before. The infection that nearly killed him didn't arrive loudly. It didn't announce itself with dramatic symptoms. It didn't look dangerous at first glance. It moved quietly, beneath the surface, along pathways most people never think about. And it took advantage of the one thing Rick assumed he had plenty of: time. Rick learned something else during his recovery, something the doctors never had to say out loud. Modern medicine is powerful, but it isn't magic. Antibiotics don't revive dead tissue. Surgery can't undo hours already lost, and experience, no matter how hard-earned, doesn't make anyone immune to conditions that operate on different rules. Some illnesses don't wait for certainty, they punish hesitation. If there was one thing Rick wished he could pass on to others, especially people his age, it wasn't fear, it was clarity. Pain that escalates quickly is not something to ride out. Pain that feels deeper than it looks is not something to monitor for a few more days. And that quiet, uneasy feeling, the one that tells you something isn't right even when you can't explain why, is not something to ignore. Rick had ignored all three, not because he was careless, but because he was confident. Linda joined him in the garage, placing a hand on his back. "You okay?" she asked. Rick nodded. "Yeah, just thinking." She smiled softly. "You do that more now." He smiled back. "I have more reason to." Rick didn't regret surviving, but he did regret how close he came to not having the chance. The cost of waiting wasn't just the part of his leg he lost. It was the understanding that time, once spent, can't be reclaimed. No matter how advanced the medicine or how skilled the surgeon, that lesson didn't come with drama. It came quietly, just like the pain had. Rick Miller is alive today because doctors acted quickly when time finally ran out. But the part that almost killed him wasn't the bacteria. It was the hours he believed he still had. And if this story stays with you longer than most, if it makes you pause the next time your body sends a signal you can't quite explain, then it has done what it was meant to do. Not to scare you, but to keep you alive.
Thank you for staying until the end with Return to Life. If you found a sense of connection or a small spark of hope, carry it with you as you return to everyday life. We look forward to seeing you in the stories ahead.